Hey guys, it's Mr. Hefner again. And today we're going to take a look at one more poet in our modernist unit. This is a poet I was introduced to for the first time when I was a college student studying to become an English teacher. His name is E. Cummings, and he was very experimental in his poetry. So it's perfect that he's in this modernist unit. His poetry bordered on the abstract, and it's characterized, visually at least, by things like he generally avoided capitalization. He often didn't use punctuation. And when he did use punctuation, he used it in a way that wasn't necessarily prescribed by the rules of the conventions of the English language. Sometimes he would take words and smash them all together into one word. Sometimes he would spread them out across the page, perhaps to create a pause or a moment of silence till you got to that next word. He chose some unusual subjects as well. We're going to take a look at a poem that I was not familiar with until I ended up teaching this 11th grade class and found it in our literature text. But I can tell you, I still remember E. Cummings' poetry from a long time ago. And like it just sticks with you once you play around with. So I would say that E. Cummings' poetry is something that you don't just simply read silently. You actually try to experience it as you're reading it, read it out loud, play around with running the words together, play around with pauses and silence and things like that throughout. And it'll stay with you. You'll own that poem. I remember E. Cummings must have been alive at the time when Buffalo Bill Cody died. Now, Buffalo Bill Cody was one of these guys from the Wild West, and the West only had a limited amount of time that it was really wild. Once barbed wire went up and the railroads went through, everything kind of settled down. And so Buffalo Bill Cody was this guy who took a bunch of famous Western actors. And when I say actors, I don't mean like on the stage. I mean people who were influential in the West, like Annie Oakley, and even, Sitting Bull at one point. The Lakota chief, had traveled with him. And he did sort of a Wild West circus that went around the world. But E. Cummings was alive and writing poetry when Buffalo Bill died. And E. Cummings paid tribute to him in a poem with an unusual title, if it was the title. Sometimes the first line of a poem just gets accepted as its title, but it was called Buffalo Bill's Defunct. And I thought that was unusual because, people die. Defunct is usually a word that we use when something is broken, when it no longer functions, it's defunct. Um, and in this particular case, Cummings used it for Buffalo Bill. But this was my interpretation of that poem, just as sort of a preview to E. Cummings. Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a water-smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? Yeah, that's the poem. Kind of odd, right? A tribute to someone, tribute to Buffalo Bill, and the idea that death now has him and what he could do in life. Breaking pigeons was when these clay targets would be thrown up and he could take his gun and shoot them and break them in the air. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons, just like that. All right. That's enough of me introducing this thing. It's time to talk formally. So let's get started. All right. The great thing about today's presentation is that I have the poem, which is relatively short, included here. And so we'll go through the introduction, we'll read the poem together, and we'll go directly to the check for understanding questions. But I really urge you, as I said at the introduction here, to revisit this poem, because E. Cummings poems should really be heard out loud, and they should be heard by you in your voice interpreting the poem. So this poem is called Somewhere I Have Never Traveled Gladly Beyond. And you'll notice in the graphic here on this top screen, there's no capital letters, even for the I. He would have been great in the day of texting, right? Today, you guys never use capital letter for I. Drives me crazy as an English teacher, but so be it. And you'll notice there's a little period stuck in there. I've never traveled period gladly beyond. And we might ask, why did he decide to put that in there? So we're going to look at who E. Cummings was, but most of all, we want to look at the experimental kind of qualities of his work today. So that's going to be our focus. This is not a comprehensive look at E. E. Cummings by any means at all. This is just sort of a quick introduction. There's a photo of E. E. Cummings. Again, like most people in this unit, born in the 19th century, lives till 1962. That's the year I was born. Not that that matters to you, but we tend to reference things by the time that we know. And so when we get to this unit, I'm always looking at where these authors would have been in my lifetime, not that far removed. And of course, this does not encourage smoking, but that was probably taken in the 1930s when everyone smoked and didn't know it was bad for you. As if, how could people not know that? So he's born in Massachusetts, like many of the authors we had during the New England Renaissance. And his father is a minister and a member of the Harvard faculty. So E. E. Cummings is going to grow up in that very well-educated Ivy League kind of atmosphere. In fact, he himself earns not one, but 2 degrees from Harvard University, Harvard College, I believe it is. No one, would snicker at that. That's quite an accomplishment. And just as Ernest Hemingway did, he volunteered to become an ambulance corps driver during World War I. Didn't want to fight in the war, didn't want to hurt people, but he wanted to do the best that he could for his country and to help his fellow humans. And he was captured and thrown in prison by the French, which is quite odd because the French were allies. But World War I was kind of messed up at that time with who was on which side. There was a lot of betrayal, and he was suspect, so he was thrown into prison for a while. When he came back to the US, he moved to Greenwich Village, New York. And we talked about this way back 3 weeks ago at the start of this unit. And we said Greenwich Village is in the southern part of Manhattan Island down, getting close to the financial district. And it was an artist community, still is today. In fact, during the daytime, if you ever get a chance, to walk Manhattan, and it's not an unsafe place, maybe some places, but the village is quite safe, and it's still an artist community. Walk through there, but this is one of these places where artists interacted with one another. They didn't operate in isolation of the world of art. And so you had poets with musicians, with painters, with sculptors, with actors, all kinds of art you found in this same area. And he himself, in addition to being a poet, was in fact also a painter. Now, if you forget everything we say today about E. E. Cummings, just remember that word experimental. He tried almost anything he could to do something new. And remember, doing something new is one of the themes of this modernist unit. It's one of the things writers and artists tried to do during this time period. Even if it was something that was traditional, make it new in some way. Put a spin on it. Do something that makes it different from the tradition. All right, now, if we were together in class, we'd use the Reader's Journal for discussion. And this question is, have you ever looked deeply into the eyes of someone else? There's an old saying, it might be cultural, I'm not sure where it comes from, that the eyes are the windows to the soul. And I love that. But sometimes it's hard to do. Try to just stare deeply into someone else's eyes without looking away. But what did you think you saw in that person's eyes? We tend to think that if eyes are the window to the soul, that when you look into someone's eyes, you can see something beyond just the superficial there. So try it sometime. Give it a little whirl here. All right, this particular piece that we have today, published in 1931 in a collection of poems that he did. I gave you the title already. We already said as highlighted here, it's the experimentation that we want to pay attention to in this one. And so you have some other words down here, that word topography. And I mentioned this at the beginning, moving words around the page, putting large spaces between words, maybe one word on the left side and then nothing on the whole line until you get to the right side. That would be topography, the way it is set up visually on the page. Look for imagery too. So what are you seeing in your head as you're reading what's going on in the poem? Diction, again, the level of language, how formal, how informal it is. E. E. Cummings doesn't use much punctuation, and when he does, he usually breaks the rules. So take a look at how he's doing that. Syntax is a word that we have here. We've talked about this before. Syntax is the order that words come in, and it's very important in English for making meaning. Some languages, not so much. If you've taken Latin, even Latin 1, you quickly learn that Latin is what we call an inflected language. We put endings on the words to show whether they're the subject, they're doing something in the sentence, or the object, they're having something done to them in the sentence. And in Latin, you can shuffle the words in any order and the sentence means the same thing. In English, there's a huge difference between the boy hit the ball and the ball hit the boy, even though they're the same words. So that's syntax. And in poetry, we often really disrupt the expected syntax, sometimes for the sake of rhyme, sometimes for the meter, and I think in the case of E. E. Cummings, sometimes to achieve something else. And that's what you're going to look for here. Now, the literary tools that we have, nothing new. We have repetition, and repetition is simply the reuse of a sound or a word or an image or something like that. And in poetry, especially more musical, lyrical poetry, we're going to have that quite a bit, just as we would have a refrain in a song. And then we also have syntax, which I've talked about. And inversion is related to syntax. Inversion is just simply where we change the expected order so that in many cases with inversion, the verb comes ahead of the subject instead of the subject ahead of the verb. So for example, an expected normal syntax sentence might be something like, let me see, I'll come up with a good one here. Bob went into the house. Bob went into the house. Subject, Bob, verb, went. Subject comes first, verb comes next. If I say, into the house went Bob, I've inverted that. The went now comes ahead of Bob. The verb comes first. This happens a lot in poetry. We talked Robert Frost earlier, and Robert Frost wrote that famous poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. It starts out, whose woods these are, I think I know. Most of the time we'd say, I think I know whose woods these are. It's more inversion. The syntax is slightly different than what we expect. And in poetry, unfamiliar or unexpected syntax is often what throws us off. So you had probably your first Shakespeare in school when you were in 9th grade, and you had another one perhaps when you were in 10th grade. We didn't do one this year because it's American Lit and Shakespeare wasn't an American, but you'll do Macbeth when you're in 12th grade. And a lot of times people struggle with the language of Shakespeare, saying, I don't get that old English. Well, Shakespeare isn't old English, it's modern English. It's the same language that you and I speak. It's just that Shakespeare tends to write in poetry. And in poetry, the syntax gets changed for the sake of the iambic pentameter and sometimes for the rhyming. And so it throws us off. It's just a little bit more difficult for us to get the first time we hear it. All right, so here's the poem. And I do not like up here, the publisher of our textbook, put this all in uppercase by E. E. Cummings. E. E. Cummings himself would have kept that all in lowercase. But here's the poem, my interpretation. Somewhere I have never traveled gladly beyond any experience your eyes have their silence. In your most frail gesture are things which enclose me, or which I cannot touch because they are too near. Your slightest look easily will unclose me, though I have closed myself as fingers. You open always petal by petal myself as spring opens, touching skillfully, mysteriously, her first rose. Or if your wish be to close me, I and my life will shut very beautifully suddenly, as when the heart of this flower imagines the snow carefully everywhere descending. Nothing which we are to perceive in this world equals the power of your intense fragility, whose texture compels me with the color of its countries, rendering death and forever with each breathing. I do not know what it is about you that closes and opens. Only something in me understands the voice of your eyes is deeper than all roses. Nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands. Let me go back to the beginning of this poem for a second here. One more slide there. There we go. So you notice it's all lowercase, or almost all lowercase. Here's a lowercase I, which we know should be capital. Most times, first letters in a line of poetry get capitalized, all lowercase. And then down here we have spring, which is capitalized. And some people might say, well, it's a proper noun. It should be. No, seasons of the month do not get capitalized. Days of the week do, months of the year do, but seasons don't. And so here, maybe just to be cantankerous, I don't know, E. Cummings suddenly capitalizes spring. You notice no spaces after the commas. They're jammed in there between two words. Is a comma supposed to separate two things? What about when we separate them and make them closer at the same time? What is E. Cummings saying here? Right. Over here, then, look at some of the, here's a colon. And again, no space after the colon, as if it's joining fragility and whose texture compels me instead of separating it. Another comma with no space. No capitalization here in these two stanzas at all. All right. And look at the idea here, though. It's something about you. It's a love poem, and you have this power over me. We tend to shut ourselves off from other people, especially in uncomfortable situations. But whoever this you is that the speaker is addressing in the poem is able to sort of like, if you peeled back fingers from a fist, one finger at a time, as if nature would peel open the petals of a flower. That's imagery that we're looking at there. I don't know what it is about you that closes and opens. Only something in me understands the voice of your eyes is deep. The voice of your eyes. What is that? Eyes speak with a voice? Fascinating. It's imagery again, but it's very experimental imagery. We might even compare that a little bit to that concept of synesthesia we had back a long time ago when we were reading Emily Dickinson poetry, and we talked about mixing the senses together, smelling colors and tasting sounds and things like that. All right, let's take a look at our check for understanding questions because we did the poem. There's nothing else for you to turn to. And as I always say, my disclaimer here, these are from the textbook series. I despise true and false questions for literature, but for this place, let's just use them at least for discussion. So number one, the subject's slightest look will unclose the speaker. And that's true, just as nature uncloses a flower petal by petal. Two, the subject is physically strong. Well, not really. That's what the subject is kind of saying here, is as I am, there is a frailty in me. How about number three? The subject holds a strong power over the speaker. Absolutely. Just as nature holds that strong power over a rose or a flower. Number four, true or false, a flower closes when it imagines snow approaching. I don't know if flowers imagine or not. If we were still working with Wallace Stevens today, something like the snowman, we would say, hey, you're giving a human emotions to things that aren't human again. You remember we talked about that? All right, so that would be true. And then number five, the subject's hands are smaller than the reins. Yeah, they're the smallest thing he could think of. The absolutely tiny to be able to do this intricate work of unclosing me petal by petal, finger by finger. All right, these are some literary terms now, important with such experimentation as this. So what is a writer's conscious reuse of a sound, word, phrase, sentence? If it comes back again and again and again, that would be repetition. Number two, what is the alteration of the normal word order? Well, word order has to do with syntax. If we alter it, let's call that inversion. And I don't like that one again because all alteration is an inversion. Inversion generally refers to when the verb now comes ahead of the subject. But for the sake of this introduction, that'll be good enough. And number three, what is the pattern of arrangement of words in a sentence? And that is what we call syntax. Syntax is very important in English. As languages grow older, syntax becomes important. When languages are young, inflection, the endings we put on words, is important. So we often think of Latin as being a very old language, but the reality is Latin is a very young language. It died young and stopped growing and changing. Its children grew up and changed. Languages like French and Italian, and Spanish, for example. And if we take Spanish, which began with Latin but has grown and changed and developed over time, we find out that inflection is practically gone. word order becomes most important. And in English, word order is very important. We still have some inflection, though, when it comes to our pronouns. That's why pronouns are a source of error for us. The difference between I and them. You know, I hit the ball hit me. We don't say I hit the ball hit I. And so it changes its form depending on whether it's the subject or the object. And all of that has to do with syntax versus inflection. All right, that's a really quick look at a really fun and interesting poet, E. Cummings. Even though we covered everything here in this presentation, I hope you'll go back and look at the poem. Try reading it out loud. Do it when you're alone, because it's always weird when somebody else is in the room and you're reading poetry out loud. But try reading it out loud. Experiment a little bit with what you think it should sound like. And then, if you're motivated, go look up some other E. Cummings poetry. I think you might find him fascinating and fun. All right, that's it for this lesson. I'll see you guys soon. Take care, everybody.